Ever get that feeling? Like you're going through the motions day after day, and you sort of step back for a second and think, wait, what's it all for?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean.
Especially when you think about like the sheer size of the universe and, the fact that we're all just, well, temporary. It can make you feel like, what's the point of anything?
Right, like nothing really matters in the grand scheme of things.
That's nihilism, right? And that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy topic, but a really important one, too. I mean, it's a question that's been around for, well, basically forever.
Absolutely. And today, we're looking at it through a pretty unique lens. We're going to be exploring the work of this Japanese Buddhist philosopher, Keiji Nishitani.
Oh, yeah, Nishitani, he's fascinating.
Specifically, his book, Religion and Nothingness. And I think this deep dive could be a great way for you to kind of shortcut your way to a different understanding of this whole nihilism thing.
Yeah, he blends Eastern and Western thought in a really interesting way.
Exactly. So we've got some really insightful analyses of Nishitani's work lined up.
Should be a good one.
We're going to be focusing on how he tackles nihilism, what his key arguments are, and, what he proposes as a solution.
Sounds good.
Our mission today is to really grasp his perspective, the Buddhist viewpoint.
Got it.
See where he agrees and disagrees with other thinkers, especially those in the West. And then we'll really dig into his solution, which revolves around this concept of emptiness.
Emptiness, śūnyatā, right?
Yeah, śūnyatā. Okay, so first things first. Who was this Keiji Nishitani guy, and why should we care what he thought about all this?
So Nishitani was a major figure in what's called the Kyoto School of Philosophy. This was a movement in Japan where thinkers like Kitaro Nishida were trying to bridge the gap between Buddhist thought and Western philosophy.
Interesting. Kind of like a philosophical East meets West.
Exactly. Now, what makes Nishitani especially unique is that he was a dedicated practitioner of Zen Buddhism. He was deep into Zazen meditation. That's like sitting meditation. But he was also deeply trained in Western philosophy.
So he had a foot in both worlds.
Yeah, and his goal was basically to explain and defend the core of this Zen experience using the language and concepts of Western philosophy.
Okay, so he's taking these profound Eastern ideas and making them accessible through a lens that we in the West might be more familiar with.
Precisely.
Now, I know he saw nihilism as a big issue, especially for the modern world. What was his take on where this feeling of meaninglessness comes from?
Well, Nishitani argued that nihilism is closely tied to our modern scientific understanding of the world. When you look at the universe through a purely scientific lens, you see a vast impersonal system governed by natural laws. And you see that life, including human life, eventually ends in death.
Yeah, not exactly a cheery picture.
Right. And so traditional religious explanations for meaning can start to feel, I don't know, kind of inadequate or unconvincing.
Like they don't really hold up anymore.
Exactly. And in that sense, he actually found himself agreeing with existentialist thinkers like Nietzsche and Sartre.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily think a Buddhist philosopher would be on the same page as those guys.
Yeah, well, they all recognize that there's no preset objective meaning just waiting for us to discover.
Okay, so they all agreed that meaning isn't just baked into the universe. But then Nishitani goes on to talk about nihility as a very specific kind of despair that comes from realizing this. How's that different from just nihilism in general?
So for Nishitani, nihility is the deep, I'd even say existential despair that hits you when you truly confront this lack of ultimate meaning.
Okay, so it's not just, oh, nothing matters. It's more of a gut punch.
Yeah, it's that sinking feeling when it really sinks in. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, he doesn't see this despair as the end of the line. He sees it as a process, almost like a necessary stage that can lead to something more.
So it's not the destination, it's part of the journey.
Exactly. He actually believed that if you're feeling this profound sense of emptiness, of lack, it could be a sign that you're on the verge of a breakthrough.
Wow, that's a pretty radical way of looking at it.
Oh.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. Now, I know Nishitani had some strong criticisms of the traditional Western ways of thinking about meaning, particularly the Judeo-Christian views. What were his main issues there?
Well, one of his main criticisms was this idea of finding meaning in something completely separate from ourselves, like a transcendent God who's out there somewhere.
Right, the classic God up in the clouds.
Exactly. And he argued that this creates a fundamental division, a separation that makes it really hard to truly connect with the divine. It's like, how can you really have a relationship with something that's completely other?
Yeah, it creates a huge distance.
Right. He also pointed to the classic problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all good, why is there so much suffering in the world?
Yeah, that's a tough one to reconcile.
And he felt that this idea of a transcendent God who imposes meaning from outside just doesn't really mesh with our experience of the world.
It feels forced, almost.
Exactly.
But even though he had these criticisms, he wasn't totally dismissive of Christianity, right? Didn't he even use some Christian ideas to help explain Zen enlightenment?
That's right. And it's a really important aspect of his thought that often surprises people. He wasn't trying to reject religion altogether. He recognized that there's a deep human desire for meaning that drives religious impulses. And he actually found some common ground with certain Christian mystical traditions, like Meister Eckhart.
Interesting, so he saw some parallels there.
Yeah, he even used terms like the love of Christ and being God-breathed to illustrate certain aspects of Zen enlightenment.
Wow, that's fascinating. So he was really trying to bridge these seemingly very different traditions.
He was looking for the common threads in the human search for truth.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to his engagement with other philosophers. You mentioned Nietzsche and Sartre earlier. He acknowledged their importance in facing nihilism head-on, but he also felt that they didn't quite get to a real solution.
Yeah, he saw their work as crucial but incomplete.
Let's start with Nietzsche. What did Nishitani appreciate about him, and where did he think Nietzsche's approach fell short?
Well, he really admired Nietzsche's courage in confronting nihilism and his attempts to find a way out of it.
Yeah, Nietzsche definitely wasn't afraid to stare into the abyss.
Exactly. And Nishitani really respected that. He also appreciated Nietzsche's ideas about the will to power and eternal recurrence. But ultimately, he felt that these concepts didn't quite address the core issue.
In what way?
Well, he argued that the will to power, this idea that we're driven by a fundamental desire for power, didn't fully account for the immediacy and presence of our experience in the present moment.
It's too focused on striving, maybe.
Yeah, something like that. And he felt that the eternal recurrence, the idea that everything happens over and over again infinitely, didn't capture the open-endedness of time and the genuine possibility of a truly new future.
So for Nishitani, Nietzsche's vision felt a bit too limited, too repetitive.
Yeah, it lacked a sense of true novelty and the dynamic flow of time. What about Sartre? What were Nishitani's main criticisms of his existentialism? That focus on creating meaning through individual will.
Yeah, that seems like it would be a point of contention.
It was. Nishitani saw Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom and the responsibility to create meaning through our choices as a valuable step. He agreed with Sartre that we need to constantly go beyond ourselves to transcend our current limitations.
What?
But he felt that Sartre's framework remained too bound up with the individual ego. For Nishitani, true transcendence requires connecting with something much larger than our isolated selves.
Something that goes beyond our own personal projects and desires.
Right, and he felt that Sartre's existentialism, while important, couldn't ultimately provide that.
So Sartre's self-created meaning was still too small, too focused on the I, to really address the vastness of existence and the problem of nihilism.
Exactly.
Okay, so all of this leads us to the heart of Nishitani's response. Śūnyatā, or emptiness. This is where things can get a little tricky, because when we hear emptiness, it's easy to think of just, well, nothing. A void. But that's not what he means, right?
Not at all. And this is really crucial to understand. Well, the Sanskrit word śūnya can mean nothing or zero. Śūnyatā, as Nishitani uses it, is far from being a simple void.
It's more than just an absence.
Much more. He describes it as a fundamental world ground, a deep and pervasive field of unity and interdependence that underlies and sustains all things.
It's the foundation of everything.
Exactly. And it's paradoxical because it's both a unifying ground and also the no ground of each individual self.
So it's both everything and nothing at the same time.
In a way, yes. It's a very difficult concept to grasp with our ordinary minds.
That's why we're doing a deep dive, right? Okay, so how does this concept of śūnyatā offer a way out of this whole meaning dilemma we've been talking about? How does it help us deal with nihilism?
Well, Nishitani sees śūnyatā as the middle way between two extremes. On the one hand, there's the trap of clinging to external sources of meaning, things that ultimately might not be real or lasting.
Like chasing fame or fortune.
Exactly. And on the other hand, there's the abyss of complete meaninglessness, the feeling that nothing matters at all.
So śūnyatā is the bridge between those two.
It is. By realizing śūnyatā, you transcend this dilemma. You see that you're inherently interconnected with everything else, and you recognize the groundless ground of your own being.
You're no longer separate. You're part of a larger whole.
Precisely.
Now, Nishitani doesn't just assert this idea, he offers arguments for it, right? I know the source mentions 6 clusters of argument that try to establish śūnyatā as the underlying condition for various aspects of our experience. Let's dive into those a bit. The first one deals with the mind-body problem. How does śūnyatā help us understand that classic philosophical puzzle?
Okay, so the mind-body problem is this common of how our minds, which seem non-physical, can interact with our bodies, which are physical.
Yeah, it's like, how do these two totally different things work together?
Right. And Nishitani argues that śūnyatā, as a fundamental field that precedes this distinction between subject and object, is what makes it possible for things to have both an inside and an outside.
So it's like the common ground that allows mind and body to exist and interact.
Exactly. It's not inherently either mind or body, but it makes both possible.
Interesting. The second argument focuses on the interconnectedness of the world, which seems like a pretty key idea here.
Absolutely. Nishitani argues that śūnyatā, as the underlying unity of all things, is what makes a coherent and interconnected world possible in the first place.
Without it, everything would just be a random jumble.
Right, and he sees this principle of interdependence operating at all levels of reality, from biological systems to economic systems to the laws of physics. It's all interconnected.
And śūnyatā is the glue that holds it all together. The third argument is about freedom, specifically the freedom of the self, and even the ability to give up that freedom for the sake of others. How does emptiness relate to our sense of free will and our capacity for selflessness?
So Nishitani believed that genuine freedom is inherent in each of us. We have this incredible potential to choose, to act, to determine our own path.
We're not just puppets.
Exactly. But he also saw this freedom as being deeply interconnected with the interconnectedness of all things, which is rooted in śūnyatā.
So our freedom isn't absolute, it's bound up with the freedom of others.
In a way, yes. And he even suggested that the highest expression of freedom might be to become the slave of all, completely emptying ourselves of our ego-centered desires and dedicating ourselves to the well-being of others.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, but it's also a very Buddhist idea, this idea of selflessness and compassion as the path to true liberation.
Okay, so freedom is both ours to claim and ours to relinquish. The fourth argument deals with the idea of individuality within this framework of interconnectedness. How can everything be fundamentally connected and yet still retain its own unique identity?
This is where things get really subtle. Nishitani argued that it's precisely because everything is grounded in śūnyatā that each thing can manifest its unique and irreplaceable individuality.
It's like the emptiness is what allows for difference to emerge.
Exactly. He saw śūnyatā as a dynamic field of force, where the fundamental energy of the universe expresses itself in the specific form and character of each individual thing.
So it's not a bland uniformity, it's the source of all the diversity and richness we experience.
Exactly. He called this intricate interplay the system of circumsessional being, where each thing is both dependent on and distinct from everything else. Think of it like an orchestra.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Each instrument is unique and plays its own part, but they're also all interconnected and contribute to the overall harmony of the music.
And śūnyatā is like the underlying harmony. This makes both the individual notes and the whole symphony possible.
Exactly.
The fifth argument has to do with time. Specifically, the two-directional infinity of time and the open-endedness of the future, which he contrasted with Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence.
Right. Nishitani saw śūnyatā not just as a unifying ground, but also as a kind of boundless infinity, a nothing that precedes and encompasses all limitations. And he argued that this infinite openness is what allows for truly new things to emerge in the world.
So it's the ground of possibility.
Exactly. And because śūnyatā itself doesn't have a fixed goal or direction, it better reflects our intuitive sense of time as flowing and the future as genuinely open.
It's not all predetermined.
Right. It's like a canvas on which anything can be painted.
Okay, and the final argument brings us full circle, back to the experience of nihilism itself. Nishitani suggested that only śūnyatā can truly account for that feeling of ultimate meaninglessness.
Yeah, he argued that traditional philosophies which focus on fixed substances or beings just can't fully grasp the radical transcendence that's hinted at in our experience of nihility.
It's like they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. Emptiness, on the other hand, with its inherent nothingness, can actually accommodate that sense of ultimate lack, that feeling that nothing ultimately matters.
So it's not afraid of the void. It embraces it.
Exactly. And for Nishitani, this was a major point in favor of the Buddhist perspective. He saw nihility not as a dead end, but as a natural expression of śūnyata's radical transcendence.
So it's not the opposite of meaning, it's a doorway to a different kind of meaning.
Exactly.
Now, the source also mentions that Nishitani talked about the logic of śūnyatā. He even drew comparisons to Hegel's genuine infinite and the idea of infinite sets in mathematics. What's the significance of those comparisons?
Well, those comparisons highlight the really mind-bending nature of śūnyatā. Nishitani described it as a true infinity, similar to Hegel's concept of the genuine infinite. Well, it's the idea of an absolute totality that encompasses all finite things, but is itself unlimited. And this helps illustrate how śūnyatā can be both transcendent, meaning beyond our limited understanding, and immanent, meaning present within everything.
So it's both bigger than us and within us.
Exactly. And the analogy to infinite sets in math, where an infinite set can contain a subset that's also infinite, points to a similar kind of paradoxical nature within śūnyatā.
It's like the rules of ordinary logic break down when you're dealing with infinity.
They do. And that's why it's so hard to wrap our minds around śūnyatā. It stretches our usual ways of thinking.
Okay, so even though śūnyatā is this fundamental ground of reality, Nishitani also talked about avidya, which is often translated as ignorance, as the reason why we don't typically experience it. What did he mean by that?
So avidya is basically the fundamental misunderstanding that keeps us from seeing śūnyatā directly. It's the tendency to cling to a sense of a separate, permanent self, and to see the world as made up of solid, independent things.
It's like we're looking at reality through a distorted lens.
Exactly. And for Nishitani, this self-centered perspective is the root of suffering. It's what keeps us trapped in cycles of desire and disappointment.
So it's not that śūnyatā is hidden from us, it's that we're blinded by our own ignorance.
Exactly.
And the way to overcome this ignorance is through practices like zazen, which can lead to enlightenment. What did Nishitani say about the characteristics of that enlightened state, that direct experience of śūnyatā?
He described enlightenment as a state of play, where you engage with the world in a spontaneous, unattached way.
It's like you're no longer taking it all so seriously.
Right. It's also a state of deep meditative absorption, or samadhi. And crucially, it involves a letting go of the ego, a freedom from self-concern.
You're not so caught up in your own little world anymore.
Exactly. And in this state, the problem of nihilism is finally overcome.
Because you're no longer attached to the idea that things have to have some kind of inherent objective meaning.
Right. You're grounded in the interconnectedness of all things. And you see that meaning arises from that interconnectedness, not from some external source.
So it's not about withdrawing from the world, it's about engaging with it in a different way.
Exactly.
Now, the source did bring up some critical points about Nishitani's overall framework. There are still some unanswered questions, particularly about how śūnyatā, which is supposed to be life-affirming, can give rise to suffering and ignorance in the first place.
Right. That's one of the big challenges for any philosophy that starts from a place of ultimate unity or goodness. If everything is ultimately interconnected and good, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world?
And why are we so blind to this underlying unity?
Exactly. Nishitani's answer was basically that avidya is beginningless, meaning it's always been there.
But that doesn't really explain where it came from.
Right, and that's a criticism that some people have raised.
There's also the question of how this emphasis on play and just sitting can really address the very real problems in the world, like poverty and injustice.
Yeah, it can seem like a very inward-focused approach.
It's like, how does meditation solve climate change?
Right. And while Nishitani would likely argue that compassion naturally flows from the realization of śūnyatā, how that translates into concrete action is something that's still being debated and explored.
So there's still work to be done in figuring out how these profound insights can be applied in the real world.
Absolutely.
Finally, the source emphasizes the crucial role that mystical experience, especially Zen experience, plays in Nishitani's philosophy. How important is that experiential element to his overall argument?
It's absolutely essential. For Nishitani, the Zen experience, this direct, non-conceptual insight into reality, is the foundation of his whole way of thinking.
It's not just an intellectual exercise.
Not at all. He's not just arguing from logic or reason. He's speaking from experience. He's saying, I've seen this, I've felt this. And he's appealing to the authority of those who have had similar experiences.
He's saying, don't just take my word for it. See for yourself. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into Keiji Nishitani's take on nihilism.
To wrap things up, What would you say are the key takeaways here? What's the main point he's trying to get across?
I think the most important takeaway is that the feeling of meaninglessness, of nihility, as he called it, isn't the end of the story.
It's not a dead end.
Right. It can actually be a doorway to a deeper understanding of reality, an understanding that's grounded in śūnyatā, in the interconnectedness of all things.
And this understanding isn't just theoretical, it's something you have to embody to experience directly.
Exactly.
And of course, there's still a lot of questions to grapple with, like how to reconcile this idea of ultimate unity with the very real suffering we see in the world.
Right, and how to translate these insights into action.
Exactly. So for you, the listener, as you're navigating your own life and your own search for meaning, remember that Nishitani offers a really different way of looking at things.
A way that might just open up new possibilities. And this deep dive is really just the beginning. Exploring Buddhist philosophy and this idea of emptiness further could be a really rewarding journey.
Especially if you're wrestling with these big existential questions.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to ponder. What if that feeling of meaninglessness, that nihilistic angst we all experience from time to time, is actually a signpost? What if it's pointing us toward a deeper, more profound sense of meaning that we haven't even begun to imagine? Something to think about.